Warm greetings to all viewers. Welcome to this first episode of what sounds perhaps a bit pompous, the second season of The Third Way Live with the SG. Welcome in particular to those of you that followed us last year, so our returning viewers and participants. I say this in particular because I would like to mention, before continuing with the welcomes, to acknowledge one particular message that I received that was particularly lovely. I think it was a week or so ago, by someone that had followed the live streams last year and was not aware that we were planning to relaunch it, asking for the date of the next live stream. So I want to acknowledge this person and thank them very much. I hope she is with us today. And of course, welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time in this exchange, this conversation that we hope we will hold very regularly, that is weekly, without interruption. And of course, welcome to those of you who have stumbled upon this and have no idea what this is all about. And therefore, after such a long hiatus, such a long period of pause, since we last had one of those live streams, one of those sessions of the Third Way Live with the SG, let me recontextualize as I welcome. And that is that this space is a space that we want to ensure as our weekly checkup, where I have the opportunity in a more direct manner than tweets or Instagram pictures to share updates on the work of the Organization of Southern Cooperation, to also share some general thoughts that I may have at any given particular point regarding the challenges and opportunities that face our Greater South as we strive collectively to build a third way of development. And also, above all, it's a space that seeks, in its limited manner, but it is an attempt, to democratize multilateralism, democratize the OSCE. Because the great fault of multilateralism is that it is often far from the realities, the preoccupations of our peoples, whether that is academia, civil society. And of course, this is a space, above all, for you to ask questions, make comments, without any kind of filter, for us to exchange, to discuss. So after my initial interventions, I will, on a weekly basis, open the floor to you. Every voice matters, even the ones that I may disagree with. And of course, before engaging in this exchange, I must acknowledge those who do the magic behind the scenes. We have here Jim, who is our Director of PACE, our Office of Public Advocacy, Communication and Engagement, that is joining us today. We have, of course, Fabian, of course, Jim from Uganda, the extraordinary Uganda, one of the greenest countries that I have ever seen in my life. And of course, Fabian from South America, from Chile. Of course, Chile I cannot unfortunately speak of, but I have visited neighboring Argentina more than once, and I must say, Fabian, that from what I understand, you should never judge Chile on the basis of what our Argentinian friends say. So hopefully we will visit Chile soon. We have, of course, Abdul Rahim, but we call him Al-Idrisi, from Jordan. And of course, Jordan that I haven't visited in a very, very long time. But they have, and I say this to all viewers, you must not only visit Jordan, but you must try a dish that they call al-mansaf, which is the most extraordinary dish. It is heaven distilled within a plate. And we have, of course, Bethlehem. But we call her Betty. Betty from Ethiopia. But by this point, Betty has been so engaged at my side in terms of the work that we do at the OSC that I am not entirely sure that we can even qualify her as Ethiopian anymore. I think that she has become Southern. She is as Latin American, as African, as Asian, but of course roots are always there because, as many people will know, our Ethiopian hosts, that is where we have our headquarters from where we are speaking, that is Addis Ababa, have a particular passion. One would even say, in the kindest possible sense, an obsession with a flat bread that they do with tef, injera. And in this we know that Betty is always faithful to her Ethiopian roots. Now, of course, we have Pearl, the extraordinary Pearl, also from Uganda. But today her nationality is the one of those, well, you could call her Swiss perhaps, because she is the one that will keep me on time. And of course, she has to keep me on time. For those of you that do not know, as Secretary General, I have gained an infamous reputation as an interminable speaker. And therefore, in order to give space for the dialogue, Pearl is Swiss today, that is keeping me on time. And Annabelle. Annabelle from Kenya. Kenya, that I have visited many times. But I must confess, in this particular case, I can't mention a particular dish. But what I do know is Annabelle, one of the committed ones, that also inspires herself from her roots. I remember that she had taken leave once and brought back this extraordinary blanket, which I use quite often. Because being Saudi myself, the cold and I have a very conflictual relationship. And that was in the colors, so it was the Masai, no? Which was extraordinary. In any way, I wanted to acknowledge them here present for the very simple reason that I am the one to speak, but they are the ones to make it happen. And this is what the OSC is about, making things happen. And of course, in speaking of making things happen, I must explain myself for those who are returning viewers. Why did we not, since December 2024, right after our General Assembly, did we not convene new episodes of the Third Way Live with the SG? And the truth is that it is because, and I say this in full knowledge, that if I am not being transparent, if I am not being blunt, then these sessions are worthless. And so at the risk of shocking some, I will be crude in saying the truth. 2025 has been a challenging year. It has been a challenging year for the entirety of the world. It has been a challenging year for multilateralism. It has been a challenging year for all multilateral organizations. And I will be blunt, it has been a challenging year for the OSC. With the announcement in January and February, early this year, of universal tariffs across the world by the President of the United States, and the dismantling of development aid agencies, the drying up of donor funds, things have been challenging for the OSC, not because we depended on USAID or that the tariffs targeted us at all. In fact, the OSC does not depend on any donor agencies. But it has generated, legitimately, economic uncertainty across the world, and in many of our member states, which has led, like in all multilateral organizations, to the delay in their contribution to the regular budget of the organization. And my focus, understandably, as you can imagine, was on this issue, and this issue alone. And whilst we're not entirely there, we are today very close to stabilizing this situation. And of course, this uncertainty that occurred, as I said, was not only about funding that we were not receiving, but out of our determination, inscribed within our charter, to ensure that this organization belongs to its member states. And that means, and I say this because let us be blunt once more, if the majority of your budget as an organization is funded by external partners, partners that are themselves no longer funding, but even if they were, then this organization no longer belongs to its member states. It belongs to who finances the budget. And from the OSCE, if the price of independence is to sometimes go through periods of challenges, then it is a price that we willingly pay. But thankfully, we are on the verge of entirely stabilizing this situation, hence the return of the third way live with the SG. But 2025 was not only about the OSCE so far. I think that there is something more important that has occurred since January, with reasons I need not, I suppose, enumerate, given how much noise it makes within social media and the traditional media. But for those reasons that I don't need to enumerate, since January, something extraordinary happened. We witnessed the death of old certainties. You see, the world order that we inherited in the 1990s achieved a singular feat. And I mentioned this as well in a recent publication that I have made in May, in Spanish, una carta meridional, apuntes desde el claro oscuro mundial, which we have a copy here. And this is not product placement, because it is absolutely free to read online at cartameridional.com or southletter.com. That is the title in English. The translation is A Letter from the Greater South, Notes Amidst Global Disorder, which we also have here. And I invite you all to read it, and above all, to give me your critical feedback, not only the positive ones. But I mention this, that is, the world order that we inherited from the 1990s achieved a singular feat. As inequalities kept exacerbating, as our social contracts were unfurling and coming undone, and as ecological equilibria were reaching a point of no return, it achieved the feat of making us all believe that it was eternal. It made us believe, with almost mystical conviction, that the end of the world was more probable than the end of that order. And since January, and ironically, from the very center of that order, the certainty is gone. The certainty is gone because we are all, from the poles to the tropics, feeling the tremor of a world order that is agonizing, even though it still refuses to die. But of course, as I say this, I also assure you that I have no aspiration whatsoever as Secretary General of the OSCE or as Manssour Bin Mussallam to play the role of a prophet. There are no certainties, only possibilities that are opening up. And when I say possibilities that are opening up, we finally have the possibility, as countries of the Greater South, as humanity at large, to finally not only transition out of that world order that fragilized our social contracts and led us to the brink of ecological collapse. We have the possibility, by questioning the very game itself, the very principle upon which that order was erected, to build a new, more equitable, sustainable, solidary world order. And therefore, the certainty that we have at this particular point is that the eternity, or the belief in the eternity of the present world order has disappeared. And that we, from the Greater South, not just the OSCE, as a collective of peoples and nations, have a choice before us. To collectively forge the future, or to allow ourselves to be passively forged by it. But to collectively forge the future, we have to understand that not a single organization, not a single country, not a single movement can ensure that we don't go the path of further disorder, we don't go the path of further conflicts erupting around the world, but truly engage the path of building a better future. We need a coalition of the willing, of governments, of organizations, of civil society organizations as well as multilateral ones, that push forward in order to build that world. And when I say a coalition, therefore, I am fundamentally speaking of unity. Unity, the field of all of our defeats. But we must build that unity in diversity, but above all, to build unity, what we need, what we require, is a vision. Otherwise, it is only beautiful declarations that are vacuous. We need a vision because without dreams, as I've said in the past, there is no mobilization, and without mobilization, there is no transformation. And this vision, which I set out in a very broad sense, it's a very short text after all, in the letter from the Greater South, requires us to work collectively towards the achievement, the realization of a stack of 10 sovereignties. The first is epistemological or epistemic sovereignty. Because nobody in their right mind would ever deny that academic and scientific knowledge has opened up luminous paths for humanity, over the decades. But it would be equally myopic to deny that there are other forms of knowledge. Knowledge is born from our peoples, in our countries, that have been historically and continue to be largely marginalized, delegitimized, and even ridiculed. And here I am not only speaking of ancestral knowledge, I'm speaking of endogenous knowledge that includes popular knowledge, knowledge that is being generated outside of the university, that is being generated within the small startup of young entrepreneurs trying to resolve energy supply at a cost-effective manner within a specific country or even within their specific village. I'm speaking of the knowledge that emerges when youth unions meet and debate about the world. And of course, here, when I speak of those knowledges, and I emphasize that it is essential that our countries, that our systems start to work towards epistemic sovereignty by including, and not just symbolically, but truly including, our endogenous knowledge. I am not promoting here at all the idea of replacing laboratories with myths. Of course, our endogenous knowledge has areas that require to be critically examined and revised and updated. But what we are speaking about here is renewing the dialogue between academic and scientific knowledge and endogenous, ancestral, popular knowledge, of coming together, saving our endogenous knowledge from amnesia, critically reviewing it, debating it, updating it, so that they may enter the global debate of ideas with their heads held high. Because otherwise, if we do not do so, we will continue as countries, as peoples, to import models, frameworks that were designed elsewhere, that emerged out of other preoccupations, and that are, in effect, lenses that were not designed to see our realities. We must develop our own frameworks. In fact, we did say it was without filters. Now, I know that my team expected the without filters to be about your questions, but I will make the without filters my own as well in speaking without filters, or very few filters. A few days ago, I attended, to exemplify what I am speaking about, I attended a diplomatic reception in which I met the ambassador of one of the countries, our partners, our friends in the north. And I was explaining to him our endeavor, that is the Festival of the Greater South, to bring artists from Latin America, Africa, Asia, that our peoples may meet. And he immediately intervened, as only the northern ambassadors do. That is the unfortunate truth. To say what would be better is that the North and the South meet. We're in this together. Of course said, yes. South-South cooperation has never been, will never be, about being against the North. That would be madness. That would be foolish. But saying that our peoples should meet has nothing to do with rejection of the North. And in fact, the truth is, to exemplify what I am saying about frameworks, and I said that to our friend the ambassador, that northern artists, singers, directors, cinematographers don't need any introduction to the South. We're already all aware of those artists, which are brilliant, and I listen to many of them, and I read many of their books. But it is the visibility of our own artists that is lacking. And the reason that I say this, and the reason that I give this example, is because what I was telling him, and that I say now when speaking of building that epistemological, epistemic sovereignty, is that in this, in going back and reviving our endogenous knowledge, revitalizing our endogenous knowledge, there is no isolationist, protectionist, conservative withdrawal. There is an act of authenticity. That is to think from ourselves, to think the world from the South, and not only the South from the world. To think from ourselves is perhaps the most authentic act of freedom that we can exercise. But of course, in speaking of our endogenous knowledge, that leads us to another of the sovereignties that we need to aim for, and that is ecological sovereignty. And the timing of this live is particularly opportune, because I think it was 2 weeks ago, I lose track of time, Addis Ababa brilliantly hosted the second Africa Climate Summit, which again is not a rejection of the fact that we have to address climate action as a collective responsibility across the world. But it makes sense that Africans also meet to discuss these challenges amongst themselves. But in any way, I'm digressing. The Africa Climate Summit, which was brilliantly organized. And what I believe, that we believe from the OSCE we should aim towards, and this is why we've established at the OSCE recently, in January, the Office of Climate Action and Resilience Enhancement. We must also achieve sovereignty that is ecological. And of course, many people will ask, but what is ecological sovereignty? Well, of course, first, the starting point. We are on a planetary Titanic, and we must address collectively, as humanity, the issue of climate change and ensure sustainability. Second starting point. Our countries of the South have contributed the least to climate change, yet bear the brunt of its consequences. And all the funding pledges made by our northern partners have rarely been fulfilled. And that is a matter that has been reiterated across the Africa Climate Summit. But you see, the South is not only in a position of greater fragility in the case of climate change. First, we also hold within our countries, within our traditions, the keys to unlock a new paradigm in terms of development that is harmonious with the environment. Many of our indigenous peoples, and I say many because not all of them, because we cannot folklorize and romanticize our indigenous peoples who are living peoples. But many of our indigenous peoples or indigenous traditions have ancestral views, cosmovisions, that have a radically different relationship with the environment. Rather than seeing the human beings as separate from the environment, seeing it as an ecosystem, a thread that runs across our nations. And many of those cosmovisions can contribute, when updated, can contribute to radically define a new paradigm where we do not oppose the environment to progress. But also, in the second part, and if I looked aside for a moment, it was because Pearl was telling me that I was speaking too much. So I will try to be more concise, faster, at a greater velocity. But the second thing is, I think we're all tired of this narrative of climate change and climate catastrophe and the end is near and the South is a victim in all of this. Mind you, climate change is real. It is an existential threat to humanity. But this narrative of the South is a victim and climate change is a disaster, which it is, but I think we have exhaustions because we have all heard it, I wouldn't even say years, decades at this point. No. From the South, we must decide to no longer content ourselves with lamentations and cries and complaints of injustice, and no longer accept patronizing discourses coming from those who caused the climate crisis. No. Ours must be the determination of transforming this crisis as a source of prosperity. That is why we speak from the OSCE of ecologically driven development. In fact, we are establishing later this year a Southern Commission for ecologically driven development. And what I mean this is very simply put. To have that ecological transition, we must have transformations that create jobs. Transformations that reduce forex disbursements in imports, that opens up opportunities for our peoples. Take electric vehicles. Electric vehicles require lithium batteries. More than 50%, or at least the crushing majority, of all the cobalt used in the batteries for electric vehicles come from a single country, the DRC. To transition towards a more sustainable world, we must ensure that this cobalt is no longer exported raw crude, but is transformed from where it is mined. That is not to say that Tesla should stop producing whatever it's producing and produce everything in the DRC, but saying to Tesla, if it wants the cobalt, then it must invest in factories that produce those batteries, ensuring economic development, ensuring job creation. But also, if we're going to speak of the ecological transition, then we have to recognize one thing, bluntly, with lucidity. The workforce needed for the transition is not yet there. And therefore, we must utilize this crisis to transform education and TVET courses, to prepare for a development that is ecological. But I will move faster because I am being looked at by Pearl, our timekeeper, insisting that I must move faster. I ask you to bear with me because it has been long since we last had this platform. And of course I will open the floor. But the other sovereignty is technological. We cannot combat climate change without technology. Of course, we must use also nature-based solutions, but we also need technology. But in terms of technology, our position is clear. The techno-digital divide will not be bridged with crumbs. imports, donations, as generous as they may be, are anesthesia at best. Because within 10 years at most, mostly sooner, these technologies will be obsolete, and we will find ourselves once again as passengers rather than drivers of this technological revolution. And therefore we must, as countries, and this is our conviction from the South, from the Greater South, from the OSCE, we must first ensure enhanced, accelerated South-South technology transfers amongst countries that share common characteristics and therefore technologies that are more appropriate to those contexts. We must also leverage open source software and develop upon it, adapt it to our needs, rather than the closed source software that are controlled by a handful of multi-millionaire private companies that put the data of our governments, the data of our peoples at risk. We must also create the conducive environment regionally as well as nationally and at the level of the South to develop our own endogenous, that is homegrown technologies, leveraging on the creativity of our youth and providing them an opportunity of development. And again, in doing all three, we must imperatively, at least that is my humble view, question the very essence, the foundations of those technologies that today shake the globe. Because technology is not just neutral. It contains biases, prejudices. And in this era, this is exemplified by artificial intelligence. In developing our own technologies, we must not replicate the logic of the existing dominant tech companies that have disguised data extractivism as free service and that have also disregarded the social consequence of technological development. But also, and this is why I mentioned AI, that disregard the realities of our countries. In the case of AI, which we use at the OSCE in terms of the Greater South Information System, and we've all played around with it. Let's not kid ourselves. Translations, for instance, are excellent between French and Spanish. They are less so into or from, say, Swahili or Nahuatl, our own languages. Why? Because this is data, AI was trained on data that comes from the North and does not reflect our realities. Whilst at the same time, now that we use it in the South, extracting our data in terms of usage. And therefore we must work towards digitizing, creating data sets for our languages, for instance, but also for our realities so that we can develop AI that not only does not exploit the data of our peoples, but above all, create an AI that can speak from our realities and therefore be more useful to us. This is why we're creating a commission, a Southern Commission for Artificial Intelligence. But I continue moving faster because how are we to become drivers of this technological revolution? By the finest, the most arduous but the most important preparation, that of our youth, who are called upon not to inherit the ruins of a decaying world, but to forge a new one. But of course, for this, it's not enough just to increase access to education, which must be done imperatively. We must also transform education so that our education systems better reflect our histories, our realities, our memories. And when I say this because until today, even on this continent in Africa where we are, many of the curricula have the history of Africa start with independence, as if there had not been nothing before. No contribution to civilization. Until today, in many Latin American curricula, they speak of the discovery, the discovery of the Americas. That is, before Columbus, there was no one in the Americas. And whoever, as I often say, whoever was there was probably very happy to be found. But and I give you a very concrete example, because our memories have been erased, and without memory, there can be no projection to the future. The first university, because it's not only about telling the story of our peoples, it's also about explaining the contribution of our peoples to the modern world. The longest university still running today was established in the 9th century in Fas, Morocco, by a woman called Fatima al-Fihri. And of course, she is mentioned nowhere in our curriculum because she committed 3 crimes. The first, being an Arab. The second, which is no less bad, being an African. And the third, which probably is the worst of all, being a woman. And therefore she was erased from our history. So we must transform our education to include figures such as her, to include the contributions of our peoples. But history is not enough. We have to face the reality of today. And therefore we need education systems that are transformed insofar as we will all remember that a few years ago we were told constantly, repeatedly, that education systems needed to focus on STEM only, and in particular to focus on producing more coders, programmers, developers. And yes, we need them. But we have historically been abysmal at predicting the direction of the labor market within a decade, because education takes time. And education reform, the true fruits mature 10 years later. Even the private sector is abysmal at predicting the direction of their own sector. But in any case, today with artificial intelligence that is able at an exponential rate and getting better at an exponential rate to code itself, you clearly need less coders, programmers, developers than you did before. No, what our youth need is not just to be put into a specialized box from which they cannot escape, and if the labor market takes a direction that is not that one, face unemployment or undignified work. No. What we need to impart are transdisciplinary skills to our youth. Skills that allow them to read the world in all its complexity, to transfer their skills from one sector to another. And similarly, speaking of coders, much has been said, much ado about nothing, has been said about the crisis of education because of AI. And yes, it is true. A certain kind of education can enter into crisis. The education system that treat our youth as empty receptacles to be filled with facts and information that they are supposed to regurgitate during an exam. In that case, yes, artificial intelligence will be much better at doing this. Then there's, of course, the one that said, well, yes, but it's about problem solving, which is more of the same. That is, the teacher asks the question, and the student's supposed to find the right answer. AI will probably, with time, be much better at this. But that is not the measure of intelligence. We need to transform our education systems to go from problem solving to problem posing pedagogy. That is, to ensure that our youth are not just asked to find the solution, but are equipped to problematize, to articulate the right problem and the right questions. And you see it in AI. ChatGPT, or any other AI software for that matter. Two people are asking the very same thing. Two different prompts, but same intent. One gets relatively excellent results, the other gets relatively abysmal results, because one knew how to articulate the question, knew how to problematize reality to ensure that AI responds. So we need to move towards problem-posing pedagogy in this educational transformation. And of course, we need contextuality. There are no... Education is ironically, or paradoxically rather, both the most universal of all development sectors and the most particular, because it is the most human of all development sectors. And therefore we need education systems that, with common principles and objectives, achieve contextuality, that is, adapt to our national priorities, to our local realities, and I dare say to the individuality of our students. And I say educational sovereignty because without the foundation of all development, that is the human being and its transformation, all other aspirations of sovereignty are elusive dreams and aspirations. We must ensure that this human dimension is at the heart of our endeavors. And I go faster. I go faster now because I am being told by the team that I have abused of the time. For how long are we?
47 minutes.
Okay, I promise that within 3 minutes Arab time, I will be done. In speaking of this human dimension, we must inevitably speak of culture, cultural sovereignty. Because without a people, there is no culture, and without culture, there is no people. And in this regard, in our efforts of development, of a third way of development from the Greater South, by the Greater South for humanity, we must democratize culture and the arts. But democratizing them is not only facilitating access, which is essential. It is democratizing its production and making sure that culture and the arts, in their production, respond to the realities of our peoples, address social conditions and transform them. Because our cultures are not mere folklore to be consumed or presented beautifully, I might add, to appease the hunger of crawling tourists that want to see how our peoples lived 500 years ago. No, we must have our roots, of course. But our cultures are like our peoples. They grow, they evolve, they transform. They do not renounce their past, but nor do they reject the present. And therefore, in this regard, we must invest in our creative industries and build bridges between them across our Greater South to ensure that there is cultural exchange. There are cultural markets that are opened up across our continents, amongst each other. We need festivals, popular festivals, that ensure that our peoples partake not only in culture as spectators, but as co-creators of the process. We need cultural houses of the Greater South that ensure cultural and artistic residencies and exchanges amongst our nations, amongst our peoples, amongst our continents. And we need to establish public funds that support our creators, our musicians, our dancers, our cinematographers, our guardians of the symbol. But of course, what is the point of speaking of all of this? Education, culture, knowledge. If at the very end of the day, many of our peoples, our citizens, our fellow human beings, die because of the lack of a cure that already exists, or because of the absence of a doctor that never arrives, or what? Because of hospitals, of which nothing remains but ruins and silence. Because I ask this, because that sovereignty, sanitary, health sovereignty, is essential. Because what future can we aspire to build? What kind of future can be erected upon avoidable tombs? You see, the structural adjustment programs, in their innocent name, that were promoted across our countries some decades ago, have become a structural disease. Their result is simple. Villages without doctors. Doctors without medicine. And in short, putting the right to life at risk. And in this regard, we must collectively work towards investing in our own health research and production facilities. And this is not just an abstract concept. COVID, I repeat it, I have said it before, I will not tire to say it. COVID exemplified it, COVID-19. Because at the height of the pandemic, our countries could not access vaccines because some had monopolized production. And when we did receive vaccines, we received the mRNA variant, which is vaccines that need to be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius in countries with a warmer climate, intermittent energy supply, and above all, and worst of all, a pronounced urban-rural divide. That is, vaccines that we could not store. So we need to invest in our own research capacities to develop the medicines and the vaccines that respond to our endemic diseases, rather than continue to import medicines at prices that drain public coffers. We need to invest in the training of our own doctors and paramedics and nurses. And we need to do all of this in service of the common good, not private profit of some pharmaceutical or insurance companies. And we must do this within the paradigm of One Health that recognizes the interconnection between human health, the flora and the fauna. Because the medicine of the future, if it is to be authentic, will also be ecological. But of course, we cannot speak, and I will go faster still. We cannot speak of one health that recognizes flora, fauna, and flora without also speaking from this very concept of food sovereignty. There will be no development, there will be no sovereignty for our countries so long as we cannot guarantee to our peoples the right to eat and to eat well, nutritiously. And there will be no development, no sovereignty, if that guarantee disappears because there is a war in Europe. And in this regard, we must shift our development, our agro-industry models from cash crops destined for exportation at prices that are miserly to core crops that feed our peoples, reduce our imports, therefore good for our forex reserves, foreign exchange reserves, ensure public health, but also create new value chains, food value chains, that return to our farmers dignity in their work, but also returns opportunity to our rural areas, where today there is nothing else than disregard. And as I come almost to a close, all of this, of course, is worthless without energy. It requires electricity. And therefore we must aim towards energy sovereignty as countries, but not based upon fossil fuels, which not only harm the planet, they also make our economies subject to external shocks based upon the fluctuation of those prices. But above all, in terms of our peoples, this lack, these millions of our citizens who do not have access to reliable internet also, but electricity, this does not only rob them of comfort, it robs them of the very dignity that we are all striving to aim for, and robs them of the opportunity of bettering their own lives. Therefore, we must work towards energy sovereignty, but the energy of the future, clean, renewable, and above all, ours. But what about, and that is a legitimate question, our oil-producing countries from the Greater South? Are we supposed to ask them to renounce to what was historically their strength? Should they accept and resign themselves to a future where they are relegated because of a direction that does not include them? Not at all. Not at all. This transition is not the announcement of the obsolescence of our oil-producing countries, but an opportunity for them. An opportunity for them to transition from the exportation of oil or the exportation of refined or crude oil towards high value added derivatives that open up new economic opportunities for them, for their peoples. In this regard, the energy transition and energy sovereignty will not lead to the benefit of some at the cost of others, but a collective endeavors where everybody gains in sustainability, prosperity, and above all, destiny. Because otherwise, we run the danger in this ecological transition, this energy transition, we run into the danger of finding ourselves in a new green colonialism. One could even call it, to make it more accurate, sustainable colonialism. Because if this energy transition means that yes, the planet is sustainable, but our countries continue to export raw and we import the solar panels, we import the electric cars, we will not achieve development. And this is why we must take into account in this energy transition that the critical minerals necessary for the ecological transition, for the just transition that we aspire to, are in our soils. No solar panels, no electric vehicles without the minerals within our countries. And we must transform them into actual, proper technologies, renewable energies. Which leads us to economic sovereignty. Because we have to face a stark reminder that our countries continue to be net exporters of raw intermediary materials, net importers of high value added products. And in this regard, I will skip the example I wanted to give. But I will give it in, actually I will give the example, but in a very concise manner. Coffee, which I have given that example time and time again. Coffee because it is the symbol of the South. Tree whose fruit is universal, whose roots are southern undeniably. Coffee only grows in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But when you look at the top 10 coffee exporters in the world, 4 are from a region of the world that does not have a single coffee tree. France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. And each one exports more coffee than Uganda and Ethiopia, the 2 largest African exporters. But you cannot blame them. They're just doing business. Because whereas we have decided to limit ourselves to producing coffee and exporting green beans, they have invested in high-value addition processes where they transform those green beans into capsules of coffee, into instant coffee, that they sell on average at $40 the bag, whereas we continue to export our coffee at less than $3 the bag. And mind you, this is the fair trade price, so we have to be grateful for it. No, what we should do is invest in the coffee processing plants. We must invest in the technical and vocational education and training to have master roasters and blenders. And we must invest in opening up markets within our countries. There is no reason that the Swiss should stop drinking Nespresso or the French Nescafé. Not at all. But let our neighbors drink the coffee that is produced by their geographic neighbor. Because true sovereignty, economic sovereignty, is not proclaimed. It isn't a manifesto. It is built. It is built in factories that transform what was once exported crude. In education, in technical and vocational education and training, that prepare our youth to create and not only to emigrate. It is built in companies that not merely mine our critical minerals, but make them into technological components. And the final of those sovereignties, of this stack of 10 sovereignties, is infrastructure. Because what is the point of achieving coffees that are made into capsules, cocoa that is made into chocolate bars, or cotton that is made into clothes, or even critical minerals that are made into devices, if our economies and markets remain suffocated by a lack of connectivity between our peoples? And this is why we need to build the infrastructure that connects our continents and our countries. And I say this because this evening, dear viewers, this evening I am traveling to Guatemala. How long will the flight be? Total with the transits? And more than 30 hours of traveling. Whereas, if we had direct flights, or semi-direct flights, at least flights that go to hubs, from hub to hub across our regions, that could be cut at the very least by half. But above all, I am traveling, because I travel commercial, with a divided delegation. Some will go through the United States because they do not have the Schengen visa, the transit visas. Others will travel through France because they do not have the US-American visas. That is, we must build the infrastructure that allows us to trade directly, ensure people-to-people exchanges constantly, without constantly having to go through the north. But we must also, in speaking of infrastructure as my last point on it, we must essentially recognize our own norths in the south, which tend to be our capital cities, our overpopulated urban centers that concentrate economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and deprive rural areas of the same. That is, we must have the infrastructure that connects our villages, our towns, and not only our capitals. We must ensure that where there has historically been disregard, emerges opportunity in those rural areas. And this is the vision that I think that in 2025, as countries, we must work towards to achieve. And for this, we need more instruments, but above all, we need the participation of our peoples as not only mere beneficiaries of this endeavor, but as co-creators, protagonists of their own future, of our collective future. And I had more to say, but I will now conclude for the sake of having time to have our exchange as I open the floor. But let me just say that the dusk of a moribund order is now a certainty. But the greater South, our peoples, our countries, we're not called and we're not interested in being the grave diggers of a decaying order. No, where some want to administer ruins, we, from the South, want to plant the seeds of the new, of the future, that is equitable, just, and sustainable for everyone, North and South alike. The winds in 2025, despite the challenges, blow in our favor. But together, we must ensure that it is not merely a change in winds, but that it constitutes a true change of course. In the words of Benedetti, para que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. That the entirety of the world may know that the South also exists. And now, having abused of this time, I promise that I will be better at time management with more episodes and more rigor or harshness from Pearl, our timekeeper. But in the meantime, we open the floor. And I will look at your questions and address them without any filters. You may also, for those that don't know, because I'm going to check the comments as they come across the platforms, but I believe you may also drop your questions by writing on a WhatsApp number. And of course, I do not filter, but I will not read the compliments. But if you want to criticize, I will read it out loud. And I thank the people who were kind. Well, I have a question from Muhammad Hassan, Ethiopia. How can we get the book, and is there Arabic version? Well, first, I thank you for your interest in reading it. So it is available online, that you can read on the website or download as a PDF free of charge. It is currently available in Spanish, which is the original language in which I wrote it, in the English translation. Today, unfortunately, the Arabic is not yet available, but it should be available soon. I am working on the translation that will soon be ready. The same case for the French. It will soon be ready as well. But in the meantime, you can check cartameridional.com if you want to read it in Spanish, or southletter.com if you want to read it in English. And I hope that you will read it and that you will share your critical views. So I see, dear SG, thank you for coming back. That is from Anonymous. Dear SG, thank you for coming back to the live stream second season. I have one question. As you said, we can start working on transforming education systems for the future we want, say 20 years from now. I want to know what you think we should do now to see this change we need at present. Well, everything that I mentioned regarding our education systems was not saying we have to do it in 20 years. It was to say we have to do it now. But we have to understand that the education sector, and I say this because before being SG of the OSC, I was dedicated to balanced and inclusive education. It is close to my heart. And in those contexts, I met not only ministries of education, but a lot of teachers, students, practitioners. And I have to say, we have to say, that education is the most thankless of all sectors. Because what you do now will bear fruit, truly mature, years later. You do not see immediately the result. What is asked of us in the education sector is not to think ourselves sprint runners, 100-meter runners. No. We need to be farmers. Those who plant, knowing that perhaps they will never see the fruit of what they have been sowing. But of course, when I say this, mind you, it means that we need now to reform our education systems, transform our education systems in line with the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education. And number one, this will not, of course, it will bear full fruit years from now, but it will have tangible, palpable impacts in the short term. When you see that, for instance, our youth start going to school and recognizing themselves in the curriculum, rather than being alienated by it. We must also, and crucially, endeavor to continue attending the urgency of out-of-school children, of dropouts, But also, and this is where these, I called it a stack of 10 sovereignties because they're interlinked. By investing in food sovereignty and nutritious food for our peoples, and investing in health sovereignty, sanitary sovereignty, we can also start ensuring, and that does not take years to implement, we can ensure that every child has access to a meal, a nutritious meal in school, which evidence has demonstrated not only ensures greater attendance, not only ensures, in terms of schools, not only ensures better results, but above all, it ensures the right to a good quality of life of our youth. But there are other things, of course, that must be undertaken. And this depends context by context. We must ensure mother tongue education, which should not take years to implement. And we must also address the debt burdens of our countries that make it so that 3.4 billion people in our countries, almost half of humanity, are in countries where the governments cannot invest in education, or at least not invest as they should, because they have to spend more on debt service than they can on education. And that will demonstrate the concrete, tangible impact that can be made when we can increase the investment in our education sectors. I hope I've answered your question. If I have not, if it is unsatisfactory, I want it to be very clear. I want you to push back. I want you to ask a follow-up. I want you to criticize my answer. I will be happy to take it back and develop further. I see a question on Facebook from Mac. What is the role of the global North in the development of the global South? That is a very good question. I could spend hours developing an answer. But for the sake of time, I will be concise. Let me say the first thing. Before we even think about speaking of what the role of the global North is in the development of the global South, let us, I dare, perhaps, be crude. We must essentially stop thinking ourselves as recipients. We are responsible peoples. We are sovereign nations. Let us take our responsibilities and ask ourselves, number one, what is the role of the global South, or the greater South as we say, in the development of the greater South? That is number one. Number two, what is development? Development is a meaningless word unless we define it. That is, where do we want to go? Where do we want to be in 20 years? And what can we do about it? And the third, in terms of the North, because as I've always said, our endeavor is not against anyone. It is in favor of our peoples, in favor of their right to a good life and their aspiration to live with the entirety of the world in justice, sustainability, and peace. In terms of the North, after we have done that work of meeting each other, engaging with each other, working together, we can certainly invite the North to partake. And what is the role of the North? To support our endeavors of reforming the international financial architecture that shackles our countries and that the North controls. The role of the North is to start working with us as real partners, equals, in a mutually beneficial partnership. I entirely support the idea that countries in the north should also benefit from their cooperation with us. But let it be on equitable, equal terms amongst sovereign peers. And that means working with us to invest in the critical sectors that we will have identified as our priority development sectors, and under terms that we will have established as per our national and regional priorities. And the North, I think the number one, perhaps, even though it's the third one I mentioned, role of the North is to stop being suspicious when we speak of South-South cooperation. Because the last time I heard, nobody has ever complained in the South when North Americans and Europeans meet. It is good that you do so. It is also good to have a space where all of humanity meets. But we also need our spaces to meet and engage amongst each other. And in this regard, I suppose, in a very short manner, is what I would say to your question, Mac, about what is the role of the global North in the development of the South. With this, I believe that having engaged for such a long period, I must bring it to a close because of the flight to Guatemala that I mentioned. But I assure you that we will be back next week at the same time, at 4:30 in the afternoon, East Africa time, Addis Ababa time, next Sunday, and every Sunday afterwards. But for now, what I would like to do is thank every single one of you that partook. I apologize that for this first episode, I ended up speaking much longer than planned, but it was the first. And I have a reputation that you must have forgotten. As an interminable speaker, I wanted to remind you of it. But in the future episode, I will ensure that my intervention is shorter and that, above all, the floor is yours. Well, I just saw a question came in that I will address now, but then I will close. From Zelalem, Ethiopia, but from Ethiopia. We are happy to see you back in this live event, Your Excellency. It was on WhatsApp. I have two questions. What strategies do the Greater South countries should implement to achieve sustainable growth and fostering a more balanced and economic landscape? What key roles should OSC play to strengthen the South-South cooperation? Well, that is a very, very profound question that is multidimensional. I will be very concise now because I do have to catch a flight. However, I promise you that after my concise response today, I will develop it further in the next live stream next Sunday. But let me say two things. Amongst the strategies to achieve sustainable growth, as I was mentioning earlier, is the first is to ensure that we have a collective determination and strategy to ensure that, one, we move from net exporters of raw materials to net exporters of high value added products. And that means creating the necessary factories that transform our coffee into capsules, transform our critical minerals into ion lithium batteries. The second is, I would suppose, to ensure that we interconnect our countries, open up markets for our countries, because without bridges, there is no sovereignty. There is only solitude. And in this regard, building the infrastructure that opens up markets amongst our countries that ensures that Africa can enhance its trade, and once it has produced high value added products, can export them to Latin America and the reverse at reasonable prices within reasonable time frames. The third is, of course, we need more financial institutions of the South that respond to our needs, our priorities, our realities. We from the OSCE, because you asked what key roles should the OSCE play, are working towards, within the next 2 years, the establishment of the Greater South Development Bank in order to invest in the critical sectors for the development of our countries, to reduce the debt burdens of our countries, and also to reduce the dependence that has become an addiction, that is, our dependence on the US dollar. When trading amongst neighbors. So we need the Greater South Development Bank, but we need more such institutions from the South. And the fourth, I suppose at this point I would raise in the concise answer, but remember that I will answer at a greater length next week, because we cannot miss this 30-hour journey to a neighboring region of the South. The fourth and final point for today's concise answer is we must also ensure greater South-South cooperation. There will be no sustainable growth for any of our countries if we do not engage between our countries. And that means that we need platforms like the OSCE that can bring our countries together, articulate common positions that are authentic common positions, not watered down compromises, that can accelerate the decisions of our countries to create this infrastructure that I was mentioning, that can accompany our countries in creating those industries that I was mentioning, and to do so from a spirit of Southern solidarity and equity. So this is what I would say for this very concise answer to, because your question would require at least 20 minutes to answer properly. That being said, I hope that it is more or less satisfactory, in the knowledge that I will return to it as the first question I will address next week. So I ask the team to keep that comment and noted. And with this, we conclude the first episode of the 2025 Third Way Live with the SG. And I look forward to seeing you again and engaging with you with more questions, we hope, and comments, because it is not only about questions, next Sunday. In the meantime, remember the words of Albert Camus, who said, when he received the Nobel Prize of Literature on the 10th of December 1957, and if there is an ambassador from the North, you see, I am quoting a French writer who said, chaque génération sans doute se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne, pourtant, sait qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa mission est peut-être plus grande encore. Celle de faire en sorte, ou elle consiste à faire en sorte, que le monde ne se défasse pas. I'm paraphrasing more or less. Each generation, without a doubt, thinks itself as bound to remake the world. Mine, however, knows that it will not remake it. But its task, its mission is perhaps greater still, to make sure that the world does not unmake itself. And today, more than 6 decades after he said those words, I think the time has come to accept that the world as we knew it, the world we inherited, has unmade itself by its own not by poets, not by prophetic leaders, not by activists. It has unmade itself on its own. What remains to us to do, collectively, from our greater self, is to ensure that the outcome of this unmaking is not worse than what has been unmade, and to work together in forging, in building, in consolidating the world that our peoples want, and that humanity in its entirety deserves. See you next Sunday.